be polite, to be nice, to obey, to do as you're told. We start equating compliance with being good and defiance with being bad. And is it sometimes bad to be so good? And what do we sacrifice? Because just going along with what other people want can actually lead to harm to yourself and also to other people. I'm Dr. Sunita Sah. I'm a physician turned organizational psychologist and now a professor at Cornell University and author of Defy, The Power of No in a World That Demands Yes.
We were raised, many of us, being the good girl and to be obedient. And I know me, I was raised to be very polite, especially in certain cultures. You have to show a lot of respect. And I think that that's wonderful in many ways. And, hopefully my daughters have some of that, but I also want them to have their own autonomy and their own ability to speak up when it is necessary for them. So I wanted to ask you, how is it that we end up to the sort of good persona, sometimes at the cost of our own needs and values, because we're so busy taking care of other people's comfort?
Yeah, it's a message that we get from a very young age. And I remember when I actually had my son and he was a baby, sort of well-meaning relatives would ask the question, is he good? And I was confused by that question because it's like, well, he's a baby. What do you mean, is he good? And what they meant was, does he sleep well? Does he eat well? Does he not cry? Does he do what you want him to do? And we start at that stage thinking good means compliance or fitting in, doing what other people want you to do, what's expected of you. And as I write in the book, I really did have a masterclass in compliance, because even my name, Sunita in Sanskrit, means good. And so I tried to live up to that. And what does being good mean? It means, as you say, to be polite, to be nice, to obey, to do as you're told. And when people do that, you hear it all the time. She's so good. She listens to me. She does this. But we start equating compliance with being good and defiance with being bad. And that that moral equation just fascinated me so much, because there are times when we shouldn't be so good and sacrifice our values. And really, I started to think about, when I delved into my research, is it sometimes bad to be so good? And what do we sacrifice? Because we give our children so much training in compliance, we also need to train them in defiance, because just going along with what other people want can actually lead to harm to yourself and also to other people. So we want to redefine defiance in a way that takes it from that negative and risky aspect to something that's really positive and meaningful and even pro-social.
Yeah, I love the word that you use, defy or defiance, because even that to me feels very aggressive and loud and pushy, where I want to say, speak up. I remember when my daughter was young, someone stole her cookie at school. And I thought, why didn't you say anything? It's a really hard thing to learn when you're young. And then even when we're older, it's really hard to do sometimes.
Yeah, if you haven't practiced that skill, it's going to be hard when you get older and you're an adult. And really that myth of defiance having to be loud and aggressive and dramatic and violent, or even superhuman and heroic, out of reach, neither of those things need to be true. We can defy in ways that are more natural to us with far less angst. And it really comes down to, what do we mean by defiance? Because it does have this negative connotation, the word. And the Oxford English Dictionary describes defiance as, to defy is to challenge the power of another person openly and boldly. And even though I don't normally disagree with the Oxford English Dictionary, I grew up in the UK, I do think that definition is too narrow and it doesn't honor our agency. After decades of research and observation, I came to this revelation that we've misunderstood what it really means to defy. And my definition of defiance is that to defy is simply to act in accordance with your true values, especially when there is pressure to do otherwise. So that's how we transform it from something negative to something positive.
I love that, because then you're really looking inward and thinking, is this something that is important to me? And am I able to speak up in this moment? Do you find that it's sometimes easier to defy or act in accordance with your values when other people are on the line? I feel like for me, being someone who is, taught to comply and be the good girl. I can speak up easily when, it's my kids are involved, my parents are involved, someone I love is involved. Even for my patients, I will advocate for them. But sometimes it's harder to speak up for myself.
Yeah, absolutely. I call this the superpower of responsibility. When we tap into our responsibility, it's far more easy to defy and overcome some of the psychological hurdles that we have. And even, we weigh the costs and benefits of defiance a lot. We think about like to defy is going to cost us a relationship, it's going to cost us a job, maybe it's going to make an awkward environment. It has to go against how we were taught to be polite. And you can still be polite actually with defiance. But we never think about sort of the costs of compliance so much until we kind of lean in. Like I find it so much easier to defy if it's for my son than for myself. So if I need a second medical opinion, I'll do that. I'm not worried about being the difficult patient in that situation. If I think a school policy harms the children, it's far more easy for me to speak up in those situations than it ever was for myself. And I think we have to recognize the situations where we do find it easier and lean into that and think, well, what factors enabled me to do that? What factors usually make it harder for me to speak up? And that really gets us to learn like where we need to practice a little bit more.
I wonder if there's a change as you get older, if you get more sick of it, where you're like, I just can't stay quiet anymore. And you just start speaking up more and more. But I don't think I realized that it's something that you can learn and you can become better at. I just thought my patience was getting less and less.
It's actually a skill set. So I always say it's not a personality, because people tend to think of defiance as a character trait, that person's so defiant. And it's not really a description of a person, it's a skill that we can choose to use or not. So we can be compliant one day, we can be defiant the other day. It's up to us to use that skill set. So first of all, we need to develop it. We need to have the ability to defy, and everybody should have the ability to defy. It's available and it's necessary for all of us. So we should really learn that skill. It's a practice, not a personality. And then we can choose when to use it and how we use it.
How do you develop this skill? How do you start to practice speaking up, defying, staying true to your values? Because I think it's easy to say that we want to do that and much harder to do, especially in circumstances where there might be a great risk involved.
Yeah, so there's the 5 stages of defiance, and that is really an internal journey that we have when we're thinking about defying. We can go through these stages, and you don't have to experience every stage. You can skip some, you can go back and forth, but it's actually a nice way to sort of think about, how do I get to stage 5, the actual act of defiance? That is when you are internally want to defy and you're trying to get there. If we're thinking about how can we sort of start practicing, one way is to really know what defiance is and what the different stages are, because usually we defy when there's 2 different forces, what we think is the right thing to do and what somebody else expects us to do. And when that's going on, when you have these 2 opposing forces, you tend to feel some tension inside. And that can manifest in many different ways in people. So some people will feel their throat constricting, some people will feel uneasy in their stomach, some people will have a headache, some people will have a dry mouth. So you really need to get to know what that warning signal is. When you feel that pull of somebody's pushing me in this direction and the pull of that's not what I want to do. I think something else is the right thing to do. So know what that tension is, because often we disregard it, we sweep it away, we think it's not worth our anxiety, it's not worth our doubt. But the second stage is actually acknowledging it, not disregarding it. We acknowledge it to ourselves and we ask ourselves, what value of mine is being compromised here? Why do I feel this tension? So it's not about a knee-jerk reaction to a gut feeling. It's actually really trying to figure out, why do I feel uncomfortable in this situation? What is it that's going against what I value? Then the third stage is a critical stage, because the research shows if you can get to stage 3, you're more likely to get to the final act of defiance. And that's simply vocalizing or escalating your defiance to someone else, or your uncomfortable feeling. And that could be in a number of different ways. You can still be in a subservient position here and just ask for clarifying questions. So what do you mean by that? Have you considered this? Have you thought about this way? I'm not comfortable with that. So it's just putting something out there And that is really huge, because even though it seems very small, it's changed the atmosphere that everybody else is operating in. So you've sent it out there, there's some kind of ripple effect, and other people have heard it. So other people might join in, they might feel the same. And even the target, even if somebody is asking you to do something, just asking them for clarification actually raises the volume on the situation. And just saying you're not comfortable with this, you can get more information at that stage. And then if they're still trying to push you in that direction, and with extra information, you still want to say no, you still want to defy, then stage 4 is your threat of non-compliance. I can't go along with that. Unless you change this aspect, I can't go along with that. Or here are my conditions, or no, I'm too uncomfortable. Thank you, but no. And it's sticking to that threat of non-compliance, and then your final act is your act of defiance. And what's really nice about that final stage 5 is that tension that you feel in the first stage, it just melts away, it dissipates, and you feel much more authentic and joy for living in alignment with your values, as opposed to sort of trying to suppress that tension and then it coming back with resentment and regret and all sorts of other things down the line.
This is a really great framework. Could we walk through an example of how this might unfold in someone's real life and what the stages would be, how they would experience those stages, so that if people are learning or practicing, they can realize, okay, this is what I would do next time. Maybe last time I didn't say what I wanted to say, but next time this is what I could do.
Yeah, I can give you my own example, since I know my own internal journey very, very well, although I give a lot more examples in the book. But when I was in the US for a couple of years, having moved from the UK, I had like this really bad chest pain, and being a physician, I was quite worried about it, and I was like, oh, I haven't felt this kind of pain before. And I went to the ER room and they did dozens of tests, including an electrocardiogram, and everything was fine, and the pain was actually subsiding. So I thought I was just going to be discharged. And then to my surprise, the doctor said, you know what, I would just like to do a CT scan. And I was like, well, what for? And they said, oh, we just want to make sure you don't have a pulmonary embolism, which is a blood clot in the lungs. And I used to work in respiratory medicine in the UK, and I know that such a blood clot causes what we call pleuritic chest pain. Like, it's really sharp pain. It catches your breath when you breathe in and breathe out. I was not experiencing that type of pain at all. I didn't have the risk factors to have a blood clot in the lungs. And so I should have said no, because even though it's, a small amount of radiation, it's still like on average 70 times more than an X-ray. And why should I expose myself to ionizing radiation if I don't need it? I should have said no. I had all the knowledge, all the understanding, but I found it very difficult to say no. I didn't want to be the difficult patient. I didn't want to tell the doctor that she was wrong, or that maybe they were acting on profit rather than putting my interests first. And so it was very difficult for me to do that. And it's actually a psychological process I've discovered in my research that I call insinuation anxiety. So this reluctance to insinuate or imply that someone cannot be trusted or is incompetent. And it keeps us silent and compliant, even when we know best. And so I felt that tension, and I did try to disregard it. But I was like, no, I feel this tension. And I got to stage 3 of like just asking little questions such as, it's just a small amount of radiation, isn't it? And I could see that she was hesitating. And then I went back to sort of stage 2, and then stage 1, just sitting in my tension. And I never got to stage 5. And yet when I left, I was just so annoyed at myself for not having said anything, that I thought the next time I'm in this situation, this is what I can do to practice, is really, now that I've experienced it, I can anticipate this might happen again. And this is what many of the aspects of defy, like when we need to defy, we can anticipate those moments. I was even talking to rookie police officers that had gone through the academy, and one of them described some really fascinating situations that they were in, that they managed to defy senior police officers, which was really hard to do. And one of the reasons is because they had a mentor before they entered the academy, and they said, I knew I was going to be asked to do some unethical things. So he had anticipated it. And this aspect of anticipating, visualizing, and then role scripting is really important. So we can get used to our mouths saying these words and our ears used to hearing it. I'm not comfortable with that. Whatever script is natural for you, just keep it in your back pocket. And so I went over this incident in my mind, and about a year later, I was going to an outpatient clinic because I had some pain in my shoulder. I knew it was inflammation from a vaccination and I wanted physical therapy, and I had to get a referral at an outpatient clinic. And yet when I went in, the way that the hospital was set out was that you had to see a lot of people before you see the doctor. And at one point, the nurse was heading me towards like a big sign that said X-ray. And I said, where are we going? And they said, to get your X-ray. And I was a little bit stunned because, you know, as a doctor that we're taught to do a history and examination with the patient before you do any investigation. So you know that it's necessary. So I said, well, I haven't seen the doctor yet. And she just said, oh, but all new patients have an X-ray first. And I just looked back at her and said, but I haven't seen the doctor yet again. And so we were kind of just staring at each other. And she said, are you refusing an X-ray? And I said, yes, because I haven't seen the doctor yet. Who knows whether I need the X-ray or not? And it seems small, but I managed to get to that aspect of like feeling the tension again, having anticipated it, visualized it. I knew what I needed to say. So asking, you know, where are we going? You know, I haven't seen the doctor yet. And then my threat, I can't have an X-ray until I see the doctor. And then when I did see the doctor, it was really awkward. And I did feel uncomfortable in that situation. And I did have insinuation anxiety. And I did say, well, you know, I think I've got inflammation. It's not going to show up on an X-ray. And the doctor was a little bit annoyed because he was like, well, you're disrupting the efficiency of our clinic and blah, blah, blah. But I managed to get my physical therapy referral. And I told him if you know, after physical therapy in 6 weeks, I'll come back and get that X-ray. Because, I mean, his differential diagnosis was bone cancer. And really, I did not think I had bone cancer. So I was quite happy with that, and I felt so great that I could say no, even though it felt uncomfortable at the time. And you know what was really interesting about that incident is that it seems very small, and most of our acts of defiance are, right? They're just between ourselves, maybe someone at the dinner table, maybe a relationship. They're not like the big acts of defiance that we might have read about, but the same things are going on. And after that experience, I was speaking to a few friends about it, and they were saying, well, you know what, you should write that up for a medical journal about sort of patient experiences. And so I did in the end. I wrote about this experience of investigations before examinations, like really sort of hinting to the aspect of we're supposed to see the doctor and have an exam before an investigation. And it got published in a top medical journal, JAMA Internal Medicine, and there was an editorial on it, and I got so many emails in my inbox. And you know what? Maybe from having said that to the doctor, maybe most likely he's not going to change the way that he practices medicine or the clinical practice. Maybe that's not going to happen. Maybe it will, maybe it won't. But that's not the point. I've given him pause to thought, even if it's for a split second. If somebody else does that, again, somebody with the same knowledge and understanding, because that is required for both consent and defiance, then maybe he'll think again. And that's ripple effect is what we can have with our small acts of defiance, that it can turn out to be bigger than you actually think. And my little small act of defiance did create a bigger conversation in the medical world about how we practice medicine. And so there's always a way that ripple effect plays out, even if it's just one other person that's witnessed it.
It's actually a big deal, especially for someone who maybe, if you're talking to a doctor, a professor, a boss, these are people who are in a position of either authority or power over you. Luckily, you knew enough information to be able to push back, where not everybody does, of course, or feel comfortable. But there are so many situations where we know there's something going on that we don't agree with, but then we don't actually speak up, or we can't, or in some situations, we're worried about the consequences. How do I know? Is this a situation where I should be speaking up? Or is this a situation where maybe I need to back down?
Yes. So my Defiance Compass has 3 big questions in it that sort of go around in a circle. And that's because the very first question is actually looking internal, first of all. And it's asking, who am I? What are my values? And when I ask my executive students to write down their values, I'm not talking about goals here. I'm not talking about beliefs, that X is wrong or abortion is wrong or abortion is right. I'm not talking about things that can have more than one answer. I'm talking about how do you want to live your life, enact your values on a day-to-day basis? And where did that value come from? Why is it so important to you? And so the values that they come up with are often sort of boil down to one single word. It's a single word, but it's very powerful if we can enact it on a day-to-day basis. And most of us cannot enact our values on a day-to-day basis. So the values are things like integrity, compassion, empathy, benevolence, autonomy, So all of these values that we might have, like what's important to you. And the reason why I have my students write it down is because the research shows if you know what your values are and you write them down and they're very salient to you, you're more likely to act in alignment with them. And then you actually have a lower stress response. Your cortisol levels are lower if you know who you are and what you stand for. So that aspect of who I am, what my values are, can be done like before any moment of crisis. And then when you're thinking about whether to defy or not, then you want to look external, like what's happening in the environment. How safe is it for me to defy? And when we think about safety, we can think about physical safety, financial safety, psychological, like there's many different aspects of safety, but we can ask, how safe is it? And then we can also ask, how effective is my defiance going to be? There's many situations, if we're talking about within workplaces, whether employees speak up or not. Did a big study with nurses and nurse managers and nurses who didn't speak up about errors. And usually they said it was, first of all, due to fear, like the consequences, what might happen if they say something. But some will say, actually, I'm not scared of speaking up. But I've spoken up many times before, but nothing changes. So both of those aspects, safety and positive impact, is something that we take into account when we're trying to decide that. But I always say we can always use these as rationalizations to never do anything. That, it's just how things are done around here. Nobody listens to me. It's going to be way too costly for me. And this is really sort of a deeply personal question as to sort of our cost-benefit analysis. Because when we think about the people that have defied, you can think about Rosa Parks' famous "No" on the bus. She asked herself, is it safe enough? Is it effective enough? It was certainly effective, and she had a community around her and really could create a movement with it. But was it safe for her? Well, actually, no, it wasn't. She received lots of death threats afterwards. She was unemployed for a decade before she found another job. She had stomach ulcers, chronic insomnia. Like, there was a lot of costs. And the reason I mention it is so we have the full human picture, because what we need to ask is it safe enough for me? Or is it effective enough for me? Like, sometimes people will defy because they're so connected with their values that becomes important and it becomes worth the cost. And we also need to think about the cost of staying silent. We spend so much time thinking about what it costs to speak up. We think staying silent is the safer option, and sometimes it is not. It costs us. If we're constantly giving away our values and not living in alignment with them, it can create harm to ourselves and to other people. We might take unnecessary medications or surgeries even. We might go along with something or find ourselves in a compromising situation. It might affect us psychologically or spiritually and ultimately physically, because if we have a lot of anxiety and stress and chronic inflammation, all of those things take a toll when you're constantly bowing your head down. So back to who am I? What type of situation is this? We're assessing safety and effectiveness. And then the last question is, what does a person like me do in a situation like this? And this is really connecting to that responsibility aspect we started talking about. Like, who am I responsible for? Myself, my community, adherence to my values, and connecting back to that. And of course, having the ability to defy the skill set is important to me. So you ask yourself, what does a person like me with these values, integrity, compassion, whatever your values are, what does a person like me do in a situation like this? And here we're tapping into our aspirational selves. How do we want to behave on a day-to-day basis? Because what we do there, how we act again and again, then goes back to the first question. That's why it's a compass. Who am I? And that goes back to our values, because we we don't want to be the type of person that's saying, oh, that wasn't me. If we keep hearing that, it is you. Like if you're acting in a particular way, that is you, especially if you do it over and over again. So if we really want to act in an alignment with our values and become a person of integrity that we think we are, then we need to ask, what does a person like me do in a situation like this?
Yeah, that's such a powerful question. It's funny because I spent a lot of my career, helping patients navigate the healthcare system, like how to speak up, how to advocate for yourself, how to ask the questions if you feel uncomfortable, sort of how to defy the system in a way that works for you and what you need. But a lot of it is also just managing what are my values. Like I feel like when I talk to patients about what do they want in life when they're juggling all these other things, how do they make change? It's hard because people think that their values are one thing and they, as you said, don't always align with them in real life. And it's not, I don't think it's because we don't want to be a person who is honest or has integrity, but it's hard to then align them in real life. I actually don't love talking about values because it's so vague and it's so aspirational. And then to bring it down to the actual day to day is really hard for people. So I love this question of what does a person like me do in a situation like this?
Yeah, it's intended to decrease that gap that we have because, my research as well has shown again and again what somebody believes their values to be is quite different from how they actually behave, right? So how do we decrease that distance between who we think we are and what we actually do? That's what the Defiance Compass is all about because we're so influenced by the people around us. How can we act in alignment with who we think we are?
You have this term I wanted to ask you about. What is the difference between a true yes and a true no?
So let's start with what exactly is a true yes. And, people often hear about sort of compliance and consent, and they often conflate the two together, but they're actually fundamentally different from each other. So a true yes is consent. And I take the definition of informed consent in medicine and I apply it to other situations that we might face in our life. So if we go back to what is compliance, compliance is something that comes from the external environment. It's an order, it's a suggestion, it could even be expectations from society, but it's something that's coming from the outside telling us that we need to behave in this particular way. Consent is something that comes from within and it requires 5 elements. So first of all, capacity. You need to have the mental capacity to be able to make a decision. You're not under the influence of drugs or alcohol, you're not too sick. The second element is knowledge. So you need to have the information to be able to make an informed choice, right? So you need to be given good, accurate information. But it's not enough just to have the information, the knowledge. You need to have a good understanding of that information, which is the third element, the risks, the benefits, the alternatives. And then the fourth element is the freedom to say no. Because if you don't have the freedom to say no, then that's merely compliance, it's not consent. And if you have those 4 elements, then the 5th element is your authorization, your explicit authorization, which can either be a true yes, if you want to go along with it, or your true no, your defiance. So a true yes and a true no are actually 2 sides of the same coin. Both consent and defiance are thoroughly considered authorizations. That's an active expression of your values.
Okay, if I was to understand this in an example, someone has all of the information they need. They understand what is expected of them. And then they can decide, I'm going to go along with what this person wants of me because I know the risks, the benefits, and I'm choosing.
If we think about, go back to sort of my example with the CT. So I had the capacity to make a decision. I actually also had the knowledge and understanding. So some people might not have those elements, but I did in this situation. I thoroughly understood the situation and I knew the risks and the benefits and the alternatives. And I did have the freedom to say no. I mean, the whole medical environment is set up on informed consent, right? I could say no, and yet I didn't for reasons, the psychological reasons of insinuation, anxiety, and other. I was still tripped up by those reasons. But here I could give my true yes, consent, or I could give what I wanted to give, which was my informed refusal, my defiance. There are situations where we have all 5 elements, but you don't want to say no. You feel at this particular time, you think the costs are too great or the benefits are too too meager and you want to delay your defiance to another day. It's not that you're going to continuously comply. In this situation, it's what I call conscious compliance. It's not just a knee-jerk yes because you feel uncomfortable. It's actually, I have all the elements for consent or defiance. But in this situation, I want to defy, but I think the costs are going to be too much. I'm going to comply for now until I can find a way to break free from this conscious compliance.
I see. And then a true no is when you have all of those elements and you still decide to defy.
That's when you decide to defy. Yes. So
Yeah,
you need the knowledge and the understanding, the freedom to say yes or no, and the capacity. You need the same elements for defiance that you need for your true no, that you need for your true yes consent.
It strikes me that there's not always the complete informed consent available.
I mean, like, not everybody can go to medical school to have the full knowledge and understanding, for sure. But it comes to a question of what is the right thing for me? Do I have enough accurate information and understanding? And we want to disentangle sort of feeling uncomfortable from this actual decision, because this feeling uncomfortable is it's a reason why we resist defiance. It doesn't mean that we don't have all the elements for defiance, right? When we think about the rookie police officer, the situation was that there had been some thefts of bicycles, and it was late in the night, or it could have been in the middle of the night, and they wanted to go into a garage to investigate to see if there were bicycles there. And he knew the law. He just he'd just completed the academy. He was very sure of his knowledge and understanding. It said, we can't go in, we don't have any standing, right? Nobody's screaming, there's no blood on the floor, we can't just break into the garage, we have to ask the homeowner. And the senior officers that were sort of 20 years more senior to him were saying, no, we're just going to go in, And he knocked and knocked on the door of the homeowner's house. There was no answer. It was like 3 a.m. in the morning. And the senior officers were like, F it, we're going to go in. And he refused to go in because he had actually trained just during the time of George Floyd's murder. And he had seen what the rookie cops did in that situation, like following the person who had been their training officer's orders to hold George Floyd down. And he just said that he did not want a repeat of something horrible happening. Like, he could imagine that they would break into the garage, search it, the homeowner would come down with a gun, something horrible would happen, and it was all because they had not followed the proper procedure. So he said no to that situation because he had the knowledge, the understanding, he connected with his values, and he knew he was doing the right thing. Even though he said no, he said it was a very quiet ride back to the station. Nothing horrible happened they managed to search the garage. There was no incident, but it was a very quiet ride for him back, and immediately he was called in to see his superior, who basically told him off for what he did. And he said even though his voice was stuttering, he knew he was right. He just said, with due respect, we had no standing, we couldn't go in. And this whole thing, he said, went around the station, and he was ostracized. He was eventually transferred to another team that he said had younger officers and a sort of new way of policing, and he was much happier there. And he really felt relieved that he went along with what he thought was the right thing to do. But it is difficult in certain circumstances. And when I think about what are the things that cause it so difficult for us to defy, why do we actively resist it? There's 3 key reasons I found in my research. And one is that enormous pressure to go along with other people, that sort of social pressure, that insinuation anxiety. We don't want to insinuate that somebody can't be trusted, even when we have like the knowledge and the understanding. The second reason is that we don't really understand what compliance and defiance are. So really understanding what is compliance, what is consent, what is a true yes, what is a true no. Redefining defiance as something positive is important. And then once we decide to define, we don't know how, because we've not practiced that skill set. So how do we put that into action? Because we need to practice. Long before the moment of crisis, we need to be practiced, because we can't just find ourselves in a situation and expect us to have that skill set right then and there.
So that means that if we didn't speak up or didn't defy in the past, it was practice for the future moment when we will defy. So we shouldn't feel so bad about it.
Yeah, like I think it's so difficult to defy is that we can use these opportunities in a way where we didn't act in alignment with our values. And it's like we have regret, because often we ruminate on that and we think, I wish I had said this. Then write that down and practice it. Like, what is it that you wish you had said? Because the next time you're in that situation, if you keep practicing it, that's the thing that's going to change the neural pathways, because we have been trained for compliance. That's why it's so easy to say yes. We fall into it and we're polite and we smile. And I talk a lot about my crocodile smile in the book as well, because that is what I do when things are awkward or you feel like, you need to appease someone else. You smile and you say, yes, okay. And so we need to practice pausing and bringing in something else and strengthening those neural pathways.
Yeah, it's so interesting because I remember being young and, we have this tradition in our family where you're supposed to hug just as a welcome. Anyone who comes into your house, anywhere you go, you have to go and hug the person, give them a kiss on the cheek. And I remember as a teenager, there were so many times where I would have to go and hug some random, everyone's an uncle, right? And you have to hug everyone. And it was very, very uncomfortable. And I would do the same crocodile smile and I would just, try to keep my distance. And when my kids were born, 2 daughters, I wanted to give them a bit more autonomy over their bodies.
Right. And again, it comes back to we can be polite, but we can go against what's expected and do something different. We're making a choice, as in, well, this is my physical space and this is what I feel comfortable with. There's other ways to greet people.
Yeah.
And then, the practice aspect is to get there. So you might be uncomfortable because you haven't done this before, but with practice, something that's uncomfortable becomes a lot more natural. So it's that aspect of also really naming, what is it that's making you feel uncomfortable? Is it insinuation, anxiety? Is it some of the other psychological processes? Because we can name it to really tame it, I say. So that's one aspect, is just knowing what's going on. Like, I want to give people the language to understand these different aspects of compliance, of consent, of defiance, of why we feel anxious, why we have fear, how do we make this calculation, and working through those aspects. And then once we understand that, it becomes so much easier.
Yeah. I think this is so important, even in today's climate. There's so much happening in the world, politically, geographically, between people. And it is a time we need that ability to have that skill and to be able to defy.
I mean, there's so much going on right now. A lot of questions that people are grappling with right now is, when is it safe to defy? But what they're really asking is it safe for me to protest? What's going to happen to me? What's going to happen to my family? What's going to happen to my job? So there isn't just one way to do it. And this is what we need to remember, is like when we say, is it safe for me to defy? There's many different ways that are more natural to us. Not everybody wants to go and protest in the way that we might see on TV, right? There's other ways to do it. You can be of help. You can make a phone call. You can write a letter. You can do what feels more natural to you. But the first step is really knowing what your values are and how to act in alignment with them. And if you're sitting in discomfort, don't be a bystander, because you're going to regret that. If we think about like what happened in even World War II, there's only 1% to 2% of sort of perpetrators, really. 90% of people are bystanders. And if they all did something small that they're comfortable with, it can change things quite dramatically. So, whatever you can do just by advocating or helping, these are the things that we need to think about. Like, how can I act in alignment with my values in a way that feels comfortable for me too? And that comfort often comes with practice as well.
Yeah, I'm sure there are people who just feel very comfortable defying and, and just can speak up anytime they want. But I think this is a really good framework for people who maybe need that practice.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, at some of my talks and readings, some activists have come to me and said that what they really liked about the book was that they thought that they were very comfortable defying, and that they realized they can defy in these situations, but perhaps not in other situations, like in personal relationships, at the kitchen table. And they also then understood why other people found it really difficult to do so, because they had not considered that before. And there were times when the people hadn't defied and they suddenly understood that, and it was such a burden removed from them. Like, I have had people come to me that they cried so much when they were reading the book, because it was something that they'd been carrying with them for a long time, and they just didn't understand why they didn't act in this particular way or why they did this. And so I think it's useful for people, whatever your relationship with defiance is, but particularly for those who do have a self-concept of being compliant and wish you could speak up much more easily than you do now.
Yeah, I remember growing up, even I felt like, oh, I want to be rebellious. And I would just say no to things just because I wanted to say no, but it probably wasn't really what I wanted to do, which isn't really a true defiance.
No.
But I imagine it's good to unpack all of this stuff with your book, which is why I'm planning to give it to my daughters.
I talk about false defiance. I talk about my teenage son with the false defiance there, where, you know, he went through that phase where he would do the exact opposite of what I would ask him to do, which a lot of people classify as defiance. It doesn't fit my definition of defiance. It's acting in accordance with your values in it, coming from within, because he's actually listening very intently to what I want and doing the exact opposite. And so that's actually a form of compliance. It's just in opposition. So this is false defiance, but we think of it as being defiant. That it is oppositional, but it's not true defiance.
That's funny. And I guess probably a part of growing up, part of being a teenager and exerting your boundaries. Thank you so much for being here. Your book was great. I will include a link in the show notes.
Absolutely. It was such a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much.